Executive budget. And I believe we have stuff to... Oh, okay. Have the record know that Representative Arms is here. That means a very special day for us. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. We're passing out some documents for you, and I'll wait till they get passed out so you'll have it in front of you. I think you've got a copy of the kind of a skinny book on the proposed budget, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation we'll be going through. So. Yeah. Yeah, she's got it.
1 minute, he says. Ready?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman and members, good morning. Jay Darden, Commissioner. Today's presentation is going to be different than the three other that the administration has made to you since our time together. Today we're not faced with the specter of a mid-year cut. We are not under the cloud hanging over a fiscal cliff. We're not living in a world of uncertain revenue, nor are we facing the need to discuss revenue to balance the budget, or so we thought. Unfortunately, revenue is going to be a topic of my presentation today in a way that the state has never experienced in more than 3 decades that the Revenue Estimating Conference has been in existence. So this morning we'll have to talk about the REC, the law, and the process, as well as the numbers that will make up the proposed budget that we present to you for your consideration. The era of instability and uncertainty should be over, but unfortunately it is not. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about what we've been able to accomplish together over the course of the past few years, then discuss in some detail where we are now, why we are here, and then tell you where we should be going. The budget that the administration brings you today puts us on a level of stability that we have not seen until now and allows us to finally make education a true priority. So let me address first, and I'll go through this briefly, where we've been and kind of what we've been able to accomplish together. In 2018, there were 47 major economic development projects occurring in 31 different parishes of our state, from West Carroll to Calcasieu, from Caddo to Plaquemines. The state's gross domestic product is at an all-time high of approximately $250 billion. Our major product activity led to the highest level of construction employment in the state's history, with more than 150,000 individuals working in our state. The Workforce Commission presents us with a quarterly personal income status, and you can see the constant growth in personal income that we've experienced from the 2008 period until now. This is obviously very encouraging for the economy, and the annual gross domestic product also shows continual growth, and we're on the proper trend, as you can see right now in 2019. This goes through 2018, but we're headed in the right direction. The Department of Transportation and Development, as you know, has been aggressively addressing some of the problems that we faced over the years in our bridges, our highways, our ports, our transportation system. In fiscal 16-17, funding for the Louisiana Port Construction and Development Program was increased from $20 million to $39.4 million. This was the first funding increase since the program was created in 1989, and that increased level has been continued and is recommended to be included in FY20. You have recognized the important need that our port systems have over the years, and we've made an investment in that. For 18 years in a row, the state has received redistributed funds from the United States Department of Transportation. In August of last year, DOT got $80 million, the largest amount that the state has ever received. This enabled us to continue work on a number of projects that had not been addressed adequately in the past. Upgrades have been made to the 511 travel information system so that travelers can now create customized routes and include traffic data from Waze and Google as they maneuver through the state of Louisiana. You'll discuss, when we finish the budget discussion, the Garvey proposal that is now advancing to a point that you'll get a report on its status. The Garvey bonds will involve reconstruction and widening of I-10 from the Mississippi River Bridge to the 10-12 split here in Baton Rouge. It is going to be a great step forward in the traffic concerns we all have about the Mississippi River Bridge and the overall area. It doesn't solve the complete problem, and obviously the aspect of a new bridge is constantly hanging over our discussions about improving traffic through Baton Rouge, but this is an important step in that process. The new interchange at I-10 at Kenner to serve the new Louis Armstrong Airport Terminal is also part of the Garvey bond proposal, as is new access from I-20 directly to Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier City. I won't go through all these accomplishments, but this committee doesn't always get an opportunity to be briefed on our CPRA efforts and what is taking place in the coast. And these slides will give you a snapshot of the process that is taking place and the projects that are underway and completed. You'll see we've completed 27 projects between 16 and 18, $5.25 billion value for the coast. 76 active projects are underway. Since the beginning of our administration together, CPRA has completed these projects, and there are 10 online for 2018. They cover the gamut of restoration and protection, from barrier island and headland restoration at the edge of the Gulf, through shoreline protection, marsh and ridge, oyster reef, and, of course, levee protection efforts. The Caminati Headlands project near Port Fourchon is the largest restoration project in CPRA history. It's an 11-mile headland barrier restoration project. CPRA also celebrated unanimous approval of the 2017 Coastal Master Plan, which is a world-class science-based approach to battle land loss that we face in Louisiana. And this is a problem that is important to all of us, and it is important, as I've said before, to people in Sheboygan and Chicago as much as it is to Shack Bay and Chauvin, because it affects America. This is America's wetland, and this is America's coast, where we deliver the seafood that America enjoys. We process the oil and gas that America and the world rely on to heat and cool their homes and drive their automobiles. And it is a vital source of our port system, obviously, which is a big part of our economy. So this is a big, important area of government that you have adequately funded, and with the cooperation of the federal government, we're seeing more funding to try and combat the loss of Louisiana. We've lost the equivalent of land equal to the state of Delaware over the course of the past 50 years. That's a pretty dramatic concern that ought to wake everybody up. CPRA has a tremendous amount of work underway across the different phases of implementation in every part of the coast. The 20 annual plan is in draft form. It'll be out for public comment soon, and they're projecting 12 additional projects, and they are highlighted on this map with the yellow rectangle around where they will be. There are another 48 active projects, with 23 expected to be constructed in FY20. Another 20 are in engineering and design. So you can see that there is no shortage of projects and no shortage of efforts underway to look at the long-term needs of the state and of the Louisiana coastline. And it's something that we'll be recommending funding for every chance we have an opportunity with one-time money. And I know you'll want to continue the efforts that have been underway to make sure this happens. In terms of budgetary reform, this is a bar chart that shows you the Budget Stabilization Fund, the Rainy Day Fund. You see we were at a peak in FY10. We're steadily trying to climb back up during the time that we've been together, and you'll see our projected numbers for the upcoming fiscal year have us over $400 million now being placed in the Rainy Day Fund, and that is based on the requirement that we put a portion of surplus dollars into this Rainy Day Fund. And obviously we have surplus money from 2018 that you will be appropriating during the budget process, and I'm confident that we will have an additional surplus based upon the excess we're seeing in our current fiscal year, and we'll have an opportunity to have a supplemental bill to address some needs, and I hope we'll have a surplus at the conclusion of this fiscal year that will be an opportunity to be addressed next go-round. The capital outlay reforms are pretty dramatic when you look at these numbers, and this is something that we have recommended to you and you have embraced, trying to paint a more realistic picture of what the capital outlay program for the state looks like. Instead of being simply a wish list that has dozens and dozens, even hundreds of projects that are not in line to be funded, weighing down the bill, it now represents a more realistic look at what we can fund, and we are being more responsible in how we address state debt. If you just look at these bottom line numbers from 2015 to now, you'll see a reduction of a $3.9 billion program to a $1.9 billion program in 2018, prioritizing our construction needs based upon our ability to pay. And the HB2 component of our budget, which is obviously an appropriation of state dollars, in the 2019 session, we're going to propose using a portion of the 2018 surplus to fund projects which debt should not be utilized to accomplish. This is essentially a debt avoidance plan and good financial management. For example, there are a number of buildings on college campuses across the state that need to be demolished for safety reasons as well as for replacement purposes and expansion purposes. It's better to accomplish this type of construction during the summer months when school is not in much session as it is during the fall and spring semesters, and it doesn't make financial sense to issue 20-year debt to simply demolish buildings. We can do this with cash, and we're going to recommend to you that we do that. We think it's a wise use of surplus dollars. The Office of Group Benefits is forecasting a premium increase of 5.5% in January of 2020 in order to maintain a healthy fund balance. For the last 2 years, OGB has implemented a variety of cost-saving measures, including a pharmacy market check and a new formulary to try and avoid these premium costs. The OGB Advisory Board, the OGB staff, and all of us in the division are going to be doing everything we can to try and avoid that premium increase. As you know, this is one of the funds that was swept in the previous administration, so the fund balance was no longer there to be able to address the ongoing expenses that are incurred in OGB. We're taking a close look at the cost-saving steps we can utilize to try and minimize any premium increase that might come about. The last increase, by the way, was 7.5% on January 1 of 2017. I think we all know that the Louisiana prison population has declined, and when you visit with Secretary LeBlanc and look at the DOC budget and talk about the progress that's been made in not having us ranked as the most incarcerating state in America, you'll see that there's been a steady decline. And a lot of this is brought about because of the criminal justice reform program and the reinvestment program. This chart shows you the savings that are projected to be realized and how they will be allocated. You know that 30% goes back to the general fund for reinvestment, or for funding in the general fund, and 70% must be directed toward reinvestment in the system to make certain that as individuals are released from incarceration, we maximize the chance that they will not become recidivists, that they become gainful members of society, have the best opportunity for education and employment possible. So 30% of this 70% will go toward community incentive grants, 20% will be for LCLA victim services, and 50% will be DOC reinvestment allocated for targeted investments for reentry, community supervision, education and vocational programming, and a list of other things that you see here to try and make certain that the involuntary occupants of our penal system don't go back again. We have historical and projected UAL payments, and you can see a pretty dramatic indication on both this chart for lasers and the next chart for the teacher system that shows you the progress that we're making in reducing the unfunded accrued liability. The state has, as you know, a very aggressive plan that's been in place for some period of time to address our unfunded accrued liability. It's been recognized as one of the top 4 such programs in the country by an independent evaluation of problems with unfunded accrued liability across the country. And this is a problem not alone here in Louisiana. It's something that many systems across the country deal with. But because this was front-end loaded in many respects, you see the decline in the amount that has to be paid to complete the first payment on our UAL schedule. $3.7 million was deposited in FY18 from surplus $17. $9.5 million will be proposed to be deposited in 19 from the 18 surplus. And these deposits represent Laser's share of 10% of the FY17 and 18 surpluses, and the same is true for teachers because of the obligation we have by statute to place 10% of any surplus toward this particular problem. So FY19, there is no one-time money for recurring expenses in this budget, as there has not been a nickel of one-time money in any of the budgets we've proposed to you and you have enacted for the state. There are no fund sweeps any longer. There's no mid-year deficit that we're having to deal with. And in fact, as I mentioned, we have an anticipated excess in the current year that we hope will become a reality. To preview a little bit of that proposed current year excess, when you get to the supplemental appropriation bill during the session, you'll see our recommendation to finalize the implementation of the LaGov financial system that requires $15 million. You'll recall during our discussions about LaGov and about Louisiana checkbook, we have maligned the fact that we've been unable to migrate all of our state departments from our very antiquated system to the LaGov system, which is an overall budgetary and financial management system. We will be able to do that if we use this one-time money to accomplish this upgrade on schedule. It will also enable us, as soon as an agency is transferred to LaGov, they will be able to participate fully in the Louisiana checkbook program, which is up and running and applicable through, in many aspects, for everybody in state government, but not fully for these departments that have not yet migrated to LaGov. We're also going to recommend that we repay FEMA for multiple disasters, including the August 16 flood, which will require a $25 million one-time appropriation. We'll also suggest that we repay the Public Service Commission and the Department of Environmental Quality $3 million that was picked from their pocket as part of one of the budget solutions over the course of the past 7 years, with the promise that it would be repaid. And this one-time money is a great opportunity to give us a chance to fulfill that commitment. And you will see a recommendation that $19 million go to higher education and TOPS, because the TOPS program has increased its usage, the number of people on TOPS this year, and they will require that supplement during the current year. And corrections will need $16 million in order to do what they otherwise are required to do by law. And as you know, you typically see corrections as part of a supplemental recommendation during that budget process. So all this would be one-time money that would be used for one-time expenses. So now let me move to the revenue dilemma that we face. In order to address this, I want to walk you through a timeline of the activity from the Revenue Estimating Conference. And you've got a sheet, I think, it's a little bit bigger than the sheet on the slides that you can see a little bit easier, but this is a timeline on REC that is important to go over so you can understand the predicament we're in regarding our uncertain revenue picture. REC met in June of 2018 to revise the forecast based upon the actions you took during the legislative session. That's a typical meeting that takes place if there's some changes that take place during a year in which revenue can be considered. And obviously we met right on the heels of the session to recognize that legislative action. At that time, the 2019 forecast, the current year, was revised. The FY20 forecast at that June meeting was only revised as part of the long-range forecast. This is very important from a legal standpoint, and I will touch on this a little bit later. But the revision that took place to the 20 forecast in June only was part of the long-range estimate of what might be there in FY20. It was not a forecast for the official budget for FY20. Therefore, there are no fees or self-generated revenue included. So REC, as we sit today, has not yet recognized any fees or self-generated revenue for FY20. The only updated dedications that were recognized are what are called Page 2 dedications. Those are dedications that are itemized on a second page of the REC forecast that are taken directly from general fund dollars. Those dedications were recognized. they pale in comparison to the dedications that were not recognized because they don't come directly from state general fund dedications. And I'll explain this in more detail as I go forward, but this is a very significant, important point to understand why we're in the fix that we're in today. The REC met again in November. The purpose of that meeting in November was, as we're required to do by law, was to update forecasts for FY20, to revise the forecast for FY20, keeping in mind that we didn't even have an official forecast at that point in time, but we were obligated by law to revise a forecast before the beginning of the next year. At that November meeting, I made a motion to adopt the recommendation of the DOA economist, whose recommendations had been the basis for our previous budgets presented to you. The Speaker's proxy, Chairman Henry, objected to that, and so we didn't have a vote at that point. All three of the remaining members of REC voiced out loud their support for that recommendation from the economist, but because it requires unanimity, a vote was not taken at that meeting when Chairman Henry indicated he was not going to support it. Nevertheless, three of us said we think it makes sense to do so. I was chairman of the REC at the time, and I called another meeting of the REC in December to give us an opportunity once again to comply with law and to enact a budget recommendation for revenue for FY20 and to have that revision accomplished. At that point in time, a motion was made to adopt the division's economist recommendation. The Speaker objected, and we failed to take any action at that December meeting. That was a very significant decision as it relates to what you had decided to do about state spending for FY19. Because if you recall, in the budget, $44 million of expenses were placed below the line, dependent upon REC recognizing money before December 31 of last year. So without a forecast being approved by December 31 of last year, the supplemental appropriations, the appropriations below the line could not be funded. Therefore, there are $44 million in expenses for the state that you had approved, if revenue was recognized, to be spent during the FY19 year. But because no action was taken to recognize that revenue in 19, it could not be spent. So some of those expenditures you will see again as part of a supplemental bill that we will submit to you. Not all of them, because the need for some of them has gone away, because it's too late in the year now to try and provide any of that funding, because the FY19 revenue was not increased by the end of the year, nor was the FY20 revenue projected by the end of the year. January 1, I cite the applicability of this statute, which I'll talk about in a minute, again, very critical to where we are today. In January 19, last month, we met again. Motion to adopt the DOA forecast once again, as recommended by the economist, which had been recommended by the other three members of REC, consistent with what we had done in previous years. The Speaker again objected, as he certainly has a right to do. It takes unanimity for REC to act, and so no action was taken by REC at the January meeting. We met again in February. At the February meeting, the vote was 3-1 to adopt not the administration economist's recommendation, but the Legislative Fiscal Office's economist recommendation. That motion was made by the Speaker, that motion was not, I guess, I don't remember who made that motion. Richardson. Dr. Richardson made that motion. I'm sorry. Dr. Richardson made that motion because he said, we got to do something, and we ought to do something so that the executive budget can be presented based upon a figure that has been approved by REC. That vote failed as well, with the Speaker refusing to recognize the revenue from the Legislative Fiscal Office, the economist. So with a 3-1 vote, we have no action recommending revenue for FY20 to present to you. There was that motion, the 3-1 motion I voted for, the President voted for, Dr. Richardson voted for, not because we thought it was necessarily the forecast we ought to adopt, because we felt like the administration forecast was the one that we should adopt, but we said we ought to have something. And I voted for that to say, okay, let's at least get something. But the Speaker didn't want to vote for that one either, so we do not have a revenue estimate. So it's no secret that we don't have a revision, we don't have a budget estimate for FY20 from the Revenue Estimating Conference. The long list of dedications and self-generated revenue that fall outside of the category that would otherwise be approved by the REC and cannot be approved in the budget is staggering. They cannot be included in an FY20 budget because there is no official forecast that recognizes these monies. And I will get into what they are in just a few moments. Now, these are the three provisions of law which are particularly pertinent here, and I apologize for having to get into citing the law to you, but it's necessary because the presentation we're making to you today is predicated on the fact that we've got to follow the law. The Louisiana Constitution says that the governor shall submit to the legislature a budget estimate that includes a recommendation for appropriations from the state general fund and from dedicated funds, which shall not exceed the official forecast. Well, as we sit today, we have no recommendation for appropriation for general fund or dedicated funds for FY20. The Constitution also says that the REC shall publish initial and revised estimates of the money to be received from the state general fund and dedicated funds for the current and next fiscal years. That constitutional provision hasn't been accomplished either. You'll note the Constitution does not refer to the phrase executive budget. This is very important as well. It talks about a budget estimate. But when you look at RS 3926A2, which I've referred to earlier, and this is the January 1, 2019 critical statutory provision, by January 1, the conference shall revise the official forecast for the ensuing fiscal year, which shall be utilized in the preparation of the executive budget. This is the first reference to executive budget. It's in statute. The law requires the conference to revise the official forecast for the ensuing year by January 1st. When REC met in December of 2018, the ensuing year was 2019. It wasn't 2020. It wasn't this upcoming fiscal year. So there can be no reliance on the action taken by REC in December of 18 as it relates to the FY20 budget. That's why, as I sit here today, technically I cannot present to you an executive budget. But nonetheless, we are presenting to you today a proposed budget that is based on the estimate of the administration's economist, whose forecast is the last one that has been adopted and whose recommended forecast has been approved twice in votes by the REC and an additional time in a voice recognition. Now, it's important to note the proposed budget versus the executive budget. It seems like a distinction without a difference, but by law, I can't sit here before you today and the governor can't come before you and say this is an executive budget because it would not be in compliance with law. But we can submit to you a proposed budget, and that's what we're doing. You're getting a proposed budget with all the normal bells and whistles and all the backup documentation and everything that you need to evaluate our recommendation for the FY20 budget. It will be reduced to the form of a bill, which we invite the chairman to file as HB1. Representative Leger will file it as a House bill as well, so there will be an instrument that reflects the budget proposal if the chairman doesn't wish to file it as the budget, but it will give you every opportunity to debate the budget beginning immediately and to talk about the eventuality that we have every confidence will happen based upon what the Speaker has said publicly at the REC meetings, and I certainly don't purport to speak for him and don't represent to you that I do, but there has been every expectation that before the time comes for you to act on a budget, you will have an REC forecast. The budget we put before you includes the revenue estimate from the division's economist, which is the one that has been in place and the one that has been voted upon and approved by 3 members of the conference. So, With that having been said,
Are you ready for questions yet, Commissioner?
I will take questions now. I would tell you where I'm going, because in case you want to hold some questions, I'm going to now go through the process that we went through to develop a budget that would have been based on the June 2018 numbers. And you'll see the devastating consequences of that. And then I will go through the specifics of the proposed budget that we're presenting to you today. I'm happy to take questions now if you'd like to ask questions, and then I'll go through the details so you can see what's in and what's out.
Representative Falconer?
Yeah, I had just a question now. It kind of pales by comparison to what we just talked about, but given that we'll be talking about the Garvey bonds here in just a minute, or later on in the agenda, I noted that your listing of the projects on page 4 of your presentation, the paper that we've got, DOTD Garvey Bond Projects, has eliminated the Bell Chase Tunnel portion of that work and moved it over to current year 2018 projects. And I just wondered if that was, if I'm trying to process this in preparation for what we're doing. We're now, because originally that $650 million that we were raising from the Garvey bonds was going to include a portion of the Bell Chase Tunnel work in addition to the funding through the tolls that are collected. So I just wondered if now that's officially out of the Garvey program, and if we're now doing that through.
And Commissioner, if you'd rather Sean get that, we'll just postpone that question if you don't mind,
I was gonna
Representative
defer to
Falconer,
Sean.
and then we'll let. So if you don't mind holding that, Representative Falconer, to when Sean comes up after this, if that's okay with y'all.
It came up in this presentation, so that's why.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll let Sean tackle that when we finish this, if that's okay. The board is clear.
Okay, so this is what I would call the twilight zone. This is the June 18 scenario. Just in summary, if you were presented today a budget based upon the June 2018 long-range forecast for FY20, which again, we can't do, it's not the forecast. If we did it that way and we went through the exercise of doing it, I can tell you we've wasted a lot of time and a lot of paper over the course of the past 6 weeks looking at budget options and scenarios. If this budget were presented to you today, it would not include $2.5 billion, $2.5 billion in dedications and self-generated revenue that have not been recognized by REC. It would not be able to adjust federal funds based upon the loss of that self-generated and statutory dedication funds that would be used as matching funds. So we estimate it is probably at least another $2 billion in federal money that would not be available in the budget because the first thing on the list isn't available to match it. There would be no adjustment for interagency transfers due to the complexity of trying to realign what are mandated state costs if some of the agencies are not funded. And you'll see in just a moment the agencies that are not funded if this were reality. And the table of organization is not adjusted to reflect the amount of layoffs or terminations if those agencies are not funded. Now, we went through this exercise in great detail trying to present or to calculate what this budget would look like, even though we know it's not the official forecast for 20. This yielded an absolutely absurd result that virtually eliminated some departments, created an unacceptable level of cuts in others. It rendered us, and you for that matter, unable to determine how much match would be available and how to calculate these interagency transfers. The interagency transfers, as I think you know, represent money that is paid from one department to another department, generally the Division of Administration, for services that are rendered to all departments of government. For example, group benefits, technology services, the legislative auditor, risk management, market rate adjustments. It would serve absolutely no public purpose whatsoever to submit a budget like that for your consideration. Even if we could do it, this is what some of the budgets would look like. The Treasurer's budget would be reduced by 79%. The Department of Insurance would have a 2% of its budget available, that's all. CRT, to promote the state, less than 50%. Public safety services, 58% reduction. Natural resources, 45%. Revenue, 99%. The people who collect the money that you spend wouldn't exist anymore. DEQ, 82%. Wildlife and fisheries, 66%. All ancillary budget agencies, 73%. I will repeat this, since no revenue estimate for 20 has been adopted, there's no estimate for dedicated funds. That means all these funds that are dedicated cannot be included in the state budget. Even if, again, the June 2018 forecasts were utilized, it contains no estimate of these statutorily dedicated funds or self-generated revenue. Therefore, without a revenue forecast, you would be unable to appropriate money for coastal projects, the Natural Resource Restoration Trust Fund, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Fund, these things I just talked about in the progress that's been made, they don't exist because revenue has not been recognized. Wildlife and Fisheries, the Conservation Fund doesn't exist. It hasn't been recognized. The Environmental Trust Fund doesn't exist. It hasn't been recognized. That's why DEQ has cut 82%. So even if we have this deep, uncertain hole, this is what the budget shortfall looks like. Almost $2 billion. That same $2 billion number seems to continue to haunt us. We thought we had resolved our $2 billion problem a year or so ago. Here it is back again if the June 18 budget were the revenue source were the one to be adopted. Almost $2 billion in money for the state that you could not appropriate. And there's a star by that 516 federal funds to point out what I've talked about already, that we have no way of calculating how much loss of federal dollars will take place because we don't know what all matching dollars would not be able to be there to take advantage of that money. So other impacts. Due to the complexity of calculating the impact of not including dedications and self-generated money, and these other things I've talked about, an example is the Department of Health. I hadn't mentioned the Department of Health yet, but as an example of the potential impact on federal funds, LDH would not be able to include $832 million in dedications and self-generated revenue that it receives. That equates to, we know, about $1.6 billion in federal money. It could be upwards of that. That's why I say it's potentially another $2 million instead of, quote, just 1.6. Again, this is an absurd result. It would not be in the public's interest to make a recommendation like that. It would not be in the public's interest for you to debate a meaningless budget like that. These are the department comparisons, and I won't go through every one line by line. That's why we gave it to you broken out by each department to show you the loss of dollars available to each budget unit if we were taking the position that we could rely on that June 2018 budget. And you have each department itemized here. As I say, I'm not going to go through them all, but you'll see there are very few that are positive or plussed up. Most of them are dramatic reductions, hundreds of millions of dollars in reductions to budgets. It makes no sense for you to contemplate a budget like that because it is divorced from reality. We know, and there has been acknowledgement, that things are better in this state and that there is an improved revenue forecast. But unless and until the Speaker is willing to recognize a forecast, we can't act on money that has not yet been recognized. So now let's talk about that real world. Let's talk about where we think we should be and can be. To print a document that is absolutely worthless from inception would be a complete waste of taxpayer dollars. Division of Administration personnel invested many hours trying to confect something that we determined was not of any value, would create confusion during what is a short legislative session for both legislators and in particular your staff. If they were faced with the reality of confecting thousands of budget amendments to a bill to try and get right in a limited period of time. And it would derail the conversations that need to take place about the important issues that are before us. Like, how do we take advantage of the improved economic situation in Louisiana? How do we plus up education in a meaningful way? What do we want to do to set the state on the proper economic course? That's what ought to be occupying your time. And I would suggest to you with this proposed budget, it will, because you'll be dealing with a sense of reality and you'll be making decisions based upon priorities. In the event that the revenue forecast is not as optimistic as we believe it is right now, you will then have to discuss what is not as important as something else. And you will be talking about not funding everything at a level that we're recommending in this budget. But that's what the process ought to be about. Because of these concerns, our decision, based upon the law, based upon practicality and based upon reality, was to give you this document that is a proposed budget. But looks everything like what would be called an executive budget. It's got all the background information, it's got all the data, and it should and could be considered by you as such. So here are the comparisons based upon this proposed budget. The general fund would be recognized at $9.7 billion. Fees and self-generated would be $3 billion plus. Stat deads would be over $4 billion. And federal funds would be, as we would expect it to be, $14 million. A $31 billion proposal on comparing these two budgets. This assumes that the hospital stabilization fee, which has been approved in the past by the legislature, remains in effect. Under this proposed budget, there are some increases, obviously. And these represent the increases. The market rate adjustment refers to the pay raise that was granted to state employees. It is annualized in the FY20 budget, and you can see it's a significant increase that is required to be funded. Retirement costs would be funded appropriately and fully as we are required to do. The risk management budget would be increased. Technology service budget would be increased, which is very critical, as I'll talk about when we get into the detail of that aspect of the budget. And the group benefit budget would be increased dramatically, representing payments that the state makes for its state employees, because as you know, it's a shared premium from employees and the employer, and we're the employer, and we would be able to properly pay our portion of group benefits under this proposed budget. It also recognizes the proposed increase in group benefits' rate structure, which I hope we won't have to do. I can't represent to you that we won't have to implement that 5.5 increase, but I'm hoping we may be able to knock it down a little bit based upon the aggressive steps that OGB is taking to try and right-size its budget. This does not include all statewide adjustments, though. So when I talk about statewide adjustments, we're talking about things that are applicable to everybody's budget. It doesn't include all of those aspects because we don't have the funding to support every bit of that. So the other major increases in the budget, we're going to have a new GO bond sale taking place in the next... Took place yesterday. I'm sorry, I wasn't able to make the meeting yesterday, but the Bond Commission approved a GO bond sale in a decent rate, and with the rating agencies now saying that Louisiana's budget outlook is stable. We're off the negative watch list, at least for now, and I hope we don't go back on it. But they have viewed our budget scenario as stable, which is good. That's the first step necessary to get an increase in bond rating, and we're going to aggressively advocate for an increase in our bond rating when the appropriate time comes with these rating agencies. But because we had a bond sale yesterday, we're going to incur the debt that comes with that, $25 million. The proposed teacher pay raise and MFP increase is in this proposed budget. I'll talk about the details of that as we go forward, and obviously it's going to be the subject of much more debate throughout the legislative process as to how it's implemented, who gets it, how much, what's appropriate, and that is a debate that ought to be taking place in the legislative session, and it will. Higher education under our budget is being plussed up by over $10 million. This is the first time in over a decade that higher education would get more money than it has in the current year. It's the first time you have had an opportunity to say higher education is a priority. And we're not just going to hold them harmless as we've done this year. We're going to give them a little bit more. TOPS is going to be increased as it needs to be because more students are taking advantage of TOPS, and that number is going up. The juvenile justice system will be able to finally open the $20 million facility that the people of this state have built in Bunkie to house those juveniles who are in the custody of the state. Almost $15 million will enable us to make that opening happen and to annualize that expense throughout the FY year. And Department of Children and Family Services will receive almost $9 million more next year. So these are new increases that we're able to have in this budget. Statewide adjustments go up partially, and the total of those adjustments I just mentioned gets you to the point that we have a $280 million increase based upon the reality that exists in the state as 3 members of the REC now see it, and hopefully we all will see as we go forward. There are still decreases, though, in the budget. The attrition adjustments have not been fully funded as they would be in contemplation of funding everything that is necessary. Personnel reductions have taken place throughout areas of state government, and we are decreasing the amount of money paid in rent because we have been able to pay off the state's debt through the Office Facilities Corporation that owns the state office buildings in downtown Baton Rouge, and we have paid off the LaSalle building and the Claiborne building. Next month we'll pay those off. So that will mean we'll pay less in direct rent because the debt's been paid off. Now, there'll still be payments of rent for overhead and what have you, but there'll be less paid by state agencies because we finally paid off the debt for the construction that took place in consolidated state government in downtown Baton Rouge. So under the proposed budget, the authorized positions that you will see have increased by 104. There's a reason for this. The Department of Civil Service has converted a number of non-TO positions to what are called authorized positions. Because of that conversion, we're mandated to show those positions as increases in the TO because they've gone from non-TO to TO. So they've gone up by 104. But the non-TO positions and other charges positions have been decreased by a net of 282 positions. So the net change in total positions is actually a reduction of 178 warm bodies. But the TO count will go up because of this conversion from non-TO to TO that was mandated by civil service. Bar chart to show you the state's general fund, and you can see the cycle that we've been on, and this chart is very revealing for a couple of reasons. First, you'll see that the overall state general fund spending from 2009 to present has stayed fairly constant. Certainly has not spiked up in this proposed budget we're giving you. But you can see in those years where the general fund was down and then steadily started increasing, taking place in times where we lost that revenue and there was a reliance on one-time money to fictitiously balance the budget. And so less general fund dollars were spent because one-time money was rolled into the budget to say everything's fine. But since we've started saying we're not doing that, we're not using non-recurring money to pay for recurring expenses, that general fund has increased a little bit. This shows you the pie chart breakdown of where the general fund goes. This is no surprise and no real change. Education gets 38% of the general fund. The Department of Health gets 26% of the general fund. Higher ed gets 11%, and the other requirements and other areas of the budget make up the smaller pieces of the pie. So specifically, as to some of the major areas of the budget that I know you're most interested in, the Department of Education. The teacher pay raise is funded at over $101 million. $75.7 million for a raise of $1,000 plus the additional related benefits for approximately 600 certified personnel. That includes teachers, counselors, therapists, and school nurses. $25.6 million for a raise of $500 plus the additional related benefits for 40,000 non-certified personnel, including service workers, classroom aides, support staff, and skilled craftsmen. The other component of the increase in education is a 1.375 increase in the MFP base amount per pupil. This is a raise from $3,961 to $4,015 per pupil. This will provide the LEAs, the local school districts, with additional operating funds that are not restricted, and is an increase in the MFP, which is something that we are supposed to be doing on an annual basis and that we now are in a position to do. It's partial restoration of the required service funding as well. This is the required service is what goes to the diocese and other entities for services that they are required to provide by law. This is only a partial restoration. It would take about double this to get them back to a full restoration because they had been cut previously. But this is a way to try and restore some of that money for in this area that had been cut. The base adjustment, that is the $38.9 million, that 1.375%, is in level 1 of the MFP that will be presented to you for approval. The raise, the $101.3 million, is in level 3 of the MFP formula, which is where we have put raises previously when we've had an opportunity to grant them. Now, moving to the Department of Health, starting in FY17, Medicaid expansion leveraged an infusion of $1.8 billion in federal funds into a $3.5 billion infusion of economic activity. There were 19,000 jobs created or retained. 481,000 low-income people had new access to health care. And as we continue to discuss Medicaid expansion, its propriety, its viability, it's important to recognize that in its application, we are drawing down significant amounts of federal dollars to help pay for it, and we have had some tremendous success stories in identifying medical problems with people who heretofore had not been treated in any manner or form, enabling us to get quicker, earlier, hopefully more effective life-saving treatment for 480,000 people who had not been subject to this program previously. And by the way, if we're not covering people under our Medicaid budget, that doesn't mean we're not paying for them in some manner or form. It means we would be paying for them through uncompensated care dollars, which are 100% state general fund dollars. People are going to get treated in some manner or form eventually, and it's a question of how we pay for it and how we most efficiently pay for it, which is an important discussion that needs to be part of this entire ongoing debate, I think. In November of 2018, LDH implemented a new Medicaid eligibility and enrollment system that connects with state and federal databases to verify in real time income, disability, citizenship, and lawful presence in the United States. This has been made possible through the Deloitte contract that you discussed and debated last year at length. It is probably the most aggressive contract that the state has undertaken, certainly in this administration and arguably for some period of time, that makes a dramatic change in how we go about identifying who is eligible for a significant amount of state and federal dollars. It is not only designed to help prevent fraud, it is designed to ensure that people who are eligible receive dollars and people who are not eligible, by fraud or otherwise, do not receive those dollars. This is a sea change in how we go about making that determination. It's going to be made in real time. It's going to use wage data now in cooperation with the Workforce Commission, and I know there'll be a lot more discussion and interest on that LDH will be able to discuss with you as we go through this implementation process. And please understand, it is an implementation process. It started in November. Normally we have projected it will take until June to be fully implemented and hopefully at that point bump free. But there are bumps in the road anytime you implement a new program of this magnitude, and there have been bumps that have been addressed and are in the process of being addressed. But it is no different than any other state in America. And in fact, we've been commended by CMS for the steps we're taking to not only implement this new program, much of which is paid for with federal dollars, but in the manner in which we're going about our effort to make sure deserving people are eligible for money and non-deserving people don't put their hands in the state pocket. In FY20, LDH is going to implement a managed care incentive program. This is the MSIP program that you have had discussed. This is entirely with self-generated revenue that's going to draw down an additional $324 million in federal funds. This is a program that is designed to incentivize our hospitals for the manner in which they provide treatment to the patients under their care. It is an important first step toward what the Secretary has talked about and I've talked about over the course of the past couple of years of having money follow the patient and making certain that the quality care that is generated in our state hospitals who receive public money is of the highest possible quality. This is an incentive program to monetarily incentivize improvements that are made in that system. And it's going to be, we hope, a good step forward that does not require any additional state general fund money. The medical vendor payments, the big dollar items that you see in our budget each year, this just kind of compares for you what we pay in state general fund versus what we pay in federal dollars and other self-generated money and dedications. That little small IAT number is the interagency transfer number. It's inconsequential compared to everything else, but you can see the vast majority of dollars for medical vendor payments come from the federal government because they underwrite and finance the Medicaid program as it exists. Now, moving to higher education, this is the actual spending by the state for our 2-year and 4-year institutions from 2009 to the current fiscal year. You can see the steady decline, the disinvestment that the state has made in higher education over this time period. It's time to reverse that. We're not going to be able to get back up to where we were in 2009 anytime soon, but goodness gracious, we ought to be able to get back up ahead of where we've been in the past 4 or 5 years. And this budget proposal enables you to do that. It provides an increase in formula funding for higher education institutions 2 and 4 year, and it provides a direct level of funding for Pennington and for our 2 ag centers, the 3 of which do not have tuition dollars upon which they can rely. This is the specialized funding that I'm just talking about, the agriculture and Pennington dollars. So the higher ed budget increases by $15.2 million in the general fund for TOPS. The formula funding increases by $6.2 million, and the specialized units increase by $4.48 million. The Office of Technology Services, HCR 121 of the 17th session charged OTS with the responsibility to evaluate the status of our technology systems within the executive branch of government. A very interesting undertaking, and one that is a computer geek's delight. They can make a determination of how flawed many of our systems are, and they've been able to do that and to tell us where we need to make some improvements. 157 legacy systems were identified at operational risk. 157 systems upon which we rely to disseminate information, to make calculations, to make certain things go as according to schedule and to serve the public are outdated. The technology is outdated. They're aged. Their inability to maintain continued support because they're so old that there is no maintenance contracts available for them any longer, and we've obviously got to do something about it. The projected replacement cost is approximately $1 billion, and obviously we're going through the process of plussing up OTS for the purpose of improving on these modernization projects. I won't go through all of them. They're here in the presentation for you. We'll try and answer any questions if you have them. But at the top of the list is the LaMed's Medicaid Eligibility and Enrollment Program that I just talked about that is being implemented and that will eventually, as you know, be integrated with DCFS for SNAP and TANF and Medicaid eligibility determinations all under one-stop shop. So in the fall of this year, someone who comes forward and says, I'm entitled to Medicaid, I'm eligible for TANF, and I need SNAP food stamp benefits, one-stop shop. We'll determine in one place if they're eligible or not. A tremendous consolidation, a tremendous reform, a tremendous long-term savings, and an erosion of the silo system that previously existed before we came in and said, you're not going to have silos anymore. You're going to have a consolidated system that is more efficient, less expensive, and a better investment for the people of this state. We'll continue to migrate state agencies into LaGov, and there are other improvements in OMV, long overdue, for state police, for OJJ, and for education management. Now, there are unfunded areas of the budget that are important and that you will hear about from the folks who come to this table and tell you of their needs. I wanted to highlight some of them for you in advance. Higher education will tell you that just to pay for the mandated increased costs that they have, group benefits increases, retirement benefits, which is huge in higher education, risk management, they need $18 million more. We're making a dent in that by the recommendation we're making to you to give them $6 million more, but it is only a third of the way of what their current need is. Early childhood will tell you of the need for potentially over $8 million. They have lost, we know that they have lost federal dollars for a pre-K expansion grant. That preschool program has not been approved for renewal by the federal government. So we know that 1,800 young people who we thought could be served in this pre-K program cannot be served any longer. That's the $8.8 million that would have to be found if we were to continue what is a very good and important program. And we're awaiting decision as we speak on continuing the larger early childhood grant, which could impact 4,500 slots currently being utilized. The department can tell you their sense of where we are. We're hopeful and we're aggressively pursuing renewal of this grant, but we can't represent to you that it's happened because it has not yet happened. We certainly hope that it does. If not, it's going to create a bigger problem for us in what is an area in the budget that we all recognize is ripe for investment. The Department of Ed has a reduction of $2.3 million in 41 positions, and going over budgets with all the departments as we do and talk about where we have to make reductions, where savings have to be realized. This was what was pointed out to us as the area that would have to be addressed in the Department of Education. We don't like having to make this recommendation, but based upon the budget we're submitting to you, this is a reduction. The Department of Health has needs rate restorations, and I know you've heard of this. In fact, there's a BA7 for discussion that is awaiting some discussion before you on a rate restoration in one aspect of LDH's operation. But they will tell you that just to return to the 2008 rates is requiring $38.8 million that is not in the budget. And you will no doubt hear from those individuals and groups that are dependent upon these rates to provide the critical services to our population that receives optional services. And statewide acquisitions and major repairs, $13.1 million. These are things that departments have said to us we need. We need a new vehicle or X number of vehicles because our vehicles have over 250,000 miles on them, and we're sending caseworkers out to see people in the middle of the night. These kind of problems that we think are real and legitimate, but we simply can't recommend to you in the budget because we don't have enough resources to do everything. So these are some of the key unfunded items that are out there. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will conclude my formal presentation and be happy to go into some details.
Just a quick question for me, if you can put the slide of what you just had on the rates. The restoration rates, is that the developmental disabled provider rates that we?
Yeah.
So those aren't in the those are not in the executive, whatever you want to call them. They're not in this.
That's
The
right.
proposed as of right now, correct?
Correct.
All right.
And let me correct.
Are they in LDH? I'm assuming that's if they're not. LDH is not accounting for that as well. Yeah. Okay. That's
Not
fine.
in the LDH proposed budget
budget.
before you today, but obviously it'll be the subject of some discussion as you go through setting the priorities. I mistakenly said that UCC was 100% state funded. That's not correct. It does get federal dollars as well, so let me make that correction.
Okay.
I didn't realize I said that.
Gotcha.
Sorry.
All right. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to spend a great deal of time rehashing REC, but I just wanted to, for members' clarification, for the FY19 and 20 adjustments that we would have made, let's say in November, since that's when the timeline started, versus what we would have done at the February meeting last week. What has changed? I think we would agree that the forecasts have gone down. 70 to $90 million, depending on which year you look at, between 19 and 20. So I just wanted to make sure we clarify that. In addition, the fees and self-generated, we had the discussion the last time. I know there's some questions around the way we do it and the fact that it wasn't done like in that form before. Still begs the question that no one is denying, including me with my objection, that fees and self-generated and stat dead dollars were certainly, which are total about $7 billion between those categories, needed to be included in this consideration for the budget. I'm glad to see that we're moving forward with what y'all would propose to do with it, should it be included, and certainly before we finish House Bill 1 on the House side, that could be the case. I just quickly, from a historical perspective, want to remind the members of the committee when 16 being an emergency year where we did a temporary tax, but if you start in 17 where we began the first special session of 17, specifically called to pull money from the rainy day to fund a mid-year cut that potentially was $120 million. That was a result of a miss at REC, and I was a member of that committee, so I'm not blaming anybody else. But that was a miss by the REC that we withdrew $99 million out of the rainy day to end FY17 with a $100 million surplus. And I'm not going to say today that the withdrawal from the rainy day was not needed, because we needed it at the mid-year to accomplish that. But the end result is the same when you've taken the money out. I will remind members, we didn't put the $100 million back in the rainy day at that point either. Move to FY18. We had 4 sessions. We spent the majority of that time working on the fiscal cliff. I think we would agree that another REC miss, and I'm only mentioning this because I'm part of that committee as well. We finished the year, even at a June meeting, not recognizing a $300 million surplus. So we went on the premonition that what we did with the keeping a portion of the sales tax, we had the benefit of the federal withholdings that had changed beginning in February. Even with that included, we didn't estimate a $300 million surplus at our last meeting in June. To find out at the beginning of August, we were over collecting at a rate of $300 to $400 million. I only say that my efforts on the REC, whether they come across sincere or not, is to improve that record of what we have experienced on REC. And I think we're $70 to $90 million to the good as a result of it as we sit here today. I would certainly not purport that we not adopt an FY20 forecast before we finish HB1. My point is, to avoid the 17 exercise of $120 million mid-year budget cut, we would be on the way to a 70 or 90 million miss, or we'd be calling REC now to reduce the forecast. That's what I was trying to avoid. That is the intent of the wait. If you go to our division of our fiscal office website, you'll see 30 years of history on what happens at our 4 or 5 different REC meetings. The later we wait in the year, the better we get. The margin of error gets smaller and smaller. That was my effort. Whether it was understood or misunderstood, I just needed to get that clear before a lot of people start asking questions. And appreciate you setting it out on the timeline, but I wanted to put the dollars to it as well.
Yes,
that's
sir.
all I have.
And Mr. Speaker, I would acknowledge what you said about the reduction. I think that is correct. It has gone down. But what would have happened had we confected an FY20 budget before the end of the year, you would have spent the money in the current year, but more importantly, we would have then had an official forecast to work with, and we would have had to submit an executive budget with that official forecast. In terms of your other comments, the misses are absolutely correct. I mean, REC, I can tell you, and I know you will confirm, is never ever going to get it exactly right. This is an estimate, and there's no government in America that gets a revenue projection exactly right. So you have to estimate, and the law contemplates an estimate, and it contemplates 4 meetings a year for the purpose of relooking at that estimate based upon changes. The points you raised about mid-year deficits deal with mid-year deficits and not realizing the money we thought we were going to have and have to make reductions. The missing link here is the official forecast at the beginning of the year, and never have we not had an official forecast at the beginning of the year at a point in time where this budget has been presented to this committee or first goes to the Appropriations Committee. And obviously, the later in the year you wait, if you wait till the very end of the year, you'll know exactly how much money you had. But we can't do that because we have to budget an entire year ahead of time. So we have to have a reasonable estimate upon which to base our decisions. And my simple suggestion to you is we have to have an official forecast to go forward. You've said it before and you just said it again. You'll have a forecast. We don't know exactly what that number will be. It may not be as much as we're presenting to you today, and if it's not, you will have to make reductions in the budget accordingly. We'll recommend to you where we think those changes ought to take place, and we'll discuss that at such time as REC makes its decision. But we'll meet again as soon as you say you're ready to recognize revenue. I think that's the next time that the president will probably call a meeting, and I hope it'll be in March or April before you have to actually take some votes in this committee.
Well, and I would also add, just from the legality, because I had staff pull that as well, to say that we're required to do it by January 1 is certainly, I acknowledge that's what the statute says. I would go back in history and show that not necessarily before every January 1 have we revised the forecast. There's been many years where that has not happened. Still done before HB1 was finalized, but not necessarily by January 1st. Just wanted to make those clarifications. That's all I have.
In the January 1st date only affects our inability not to have done the appropriations that are below the line. The fact that there is no official forecast for 20 is the provision of law that prevents us from giving you what is called an executive budget.
Correct.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quick question. You have on the REC timeline chart here, you have that the committee voted 3-1 to adopt the fiscal office.
In February.
In the fiscal office adoption, correct?
Correct.
And that would have been Greg Manfred's at roughly about $90 million more, correct?
That's right.
But in your executive, or in the proposed budget that you use, you don't use that number.
Correct.
You use Manfred's number, the Division of Administration, which is $134 million.
That's right.
So you included in this proposed budget money that you all didn't even agree on in February.
Well, there hadn't been an agreement on anything, so yes, we have to include a number that's never been agreed upon because.
Wait, I mean three.
there isn't
So
agreement.
my question.
Why? I know-
So
I know-
you had 3-1, and you being one of the three said this is a good number. Yet when you bring a document to us, you pick the higher of the two numbers. Is there some reason? Is something changed between whenever that meeting was, the beginning of the month, and now that make you feel more comfortable that when REC meets, they're going to take the higher number of the two?
No, there are two reasons why the budget is presented to you with the 134 figure. Because three members of the committee 3 times previously voted to recognize that as the official forecast for the state, based upon what the economists were giving us as information. And the vote on the LFO forecast was done on a motion by the economists to try and throw out a compromise, to try and let's get something out there so there will be an official forecast, because he recognized we're obligated to present an official forecast. That too was defeated 3-1 with the president, Jim, and I all voting for it on the basis of, if you're not going to vote for the administration forecast, go on and vote for your own guy's view. And we didn't get that either. The second reason, and perhaps the more important reason, is we didn't put this budget together last week. We've been working on this since November, and at some point in time, we have to make a determination as to how to put a budget together based upon a number that we believe is appropriate. And as we got later and later in this process, we had REC voting 3 times for this higher number, and we had to put something before you, and we put before you the higher number with the hope that that is what will be recognized by REC. If it ultimately is not and it goes down, we'll all together decide what in this budget that's proposed today won't be funded and what will be funded.
Because that's when you discuss, you're going to give us a list if you choose a different number. If there's some adjustments, you all are going to give us a list of things that you, at that point, you'd say we're going to add to that unfunded group. And for the stat eds and the fees, they can't go anywhere else, correct? I mean, we can't take that money and move it to another department. They go straight, whenever the money comes in, boom, goes straight to them, correct?
But yes.
The fees and self-generated, right? I mean, they can't go anywhere else. So whenever the money's recognized, we know that even if we all agree we wanted to put it somewhere else, we really couldn't do it.
That's correct.
And the same with the federal dollars, correct? When the federal dollars come in, we can't touch any of that either. We get in trouble for that as well, right?
They only come down based upon the match that we provide.
Based upon the match. So between the stat deads, the self-generated, and the federal, we can't do anything about where that money goes. We have to recognize it, we have to acknowledge it, but really can't move it around too much, correct?
That's right. And that's why our discussion usually centers around general fund dollars.
But that was my next thing. So then you have the general fund, but then the general fund itself is really divided into 2 separate sections, right? Discretionary and non-discretionary.
Right.
Is that kind of how it breaks down in a broad term? So then the discretionary part is about, let's say, $3.3 billion. And the non-discretionary, which means you really can't do anything about it, again, is about $6.2 million. Let's go last year. And a lot of that, obviously, a big chunk of that is MFP, everything else. So when you look at the entire budget perspective from an outside that knows nothing, and they look at a $30 billion budget, and they go, why can't you do this? Why can't you do this? What's the problem? What we really have access to as a committee, and you included, is about $3.34 billion, right? Everything else has pretty much got a lane that as soon as the money's put in, it goes straight in, correct?
That's exactly right.
So, though it's important at some point in time to recognize the statutorily dedicated revenue, we already know where it's going to go, correct? There's no question about where that's going to go, and there's no question where the federal dollars are going to go. The only thing we're really going to debate is who gets money, who doesn't get money, of about not saying it's a little amount of money, about $4 billion. We'll get the exact amount later. About $4 billion of where we have to actually spend. Is that correct?
Correct. That is correct.
So do you think the general, and this is just a broad, do you think the general public understands that out of a $30 billion budget, we as a group get to maneuver whatever you want to change, adjust $4 billion of that?
I would say to you probably not, based upon my experience around here, and I'm sure based on yours as well. And just we've talked about this. I talk about this till I'm blue in the face, talking about the real money that we have to make decisions on and how much of our dollars are dedicated. Senator Hewitt spends a lot of time talking about how we might ought to consider undedicating some money so that more of that general fund is available, because the stat debt is nothing more than a general fund dollar that you have legislatively decided goes someplace.
Not necessarily me, in the future.
Collectively,
way back when.
And that's but yeah. And is there a general recognition of that? No, I don't. I mean, I think we all would acknowledge the public as a whole probably doesn't know a lot of the details or nuances about the way the state budget operates, and it's very difficult to understand it because it's confusing and there are different reports that go out. And we do, all of you, I know, do the best you can to educate your constituents. I know I do as well every chance I talk about it, but nonetheless, it's a confusing. Governmental funding is a confusing situation at every level, I would say to you, and that's no different here.
Yeah, no, and I just wanted to make that point to all the folks that have fees and self-generated revenue who may not understand the process, who may feel like, oh, if they don't do it today or tomorrow, then they're going to take the money and put it somewhere else, or it's going to go somewhere else. There's only one place it can go, exactly where it's dedicated to go. So eventually eventually we will meet and recognize something, but those fees and self-generated revenue, which we all agree on the amount, I don't think we have a debate on that amount. We're really debating the state general fund dollars. That money will go right back to where those agencies expected to go and where we legally have to put it.
Once there's an official forecast, that's correct.
So we're good there. Representative Bagley?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chairman. My question's about on the back page about the unfunded budget issues for 2020. And my issue is with the ICFs and the funding there. I know of one in particular that's lost about $500,000 already since December. They can't continue to work like that. And I've talked to the governor, I've talked to Dr. Gee, and now I'm talking to you. And it says they're unfunded, but it was my impression that when we left that those things would be taken care of. And I know that it was promised that there would be rebased to back to the 2008 rates where they wouldn't lose so much money. So what are we going to do? What am I going to tell these people now all over the state that have these problems?
Under the budget as it's presented to you today, it's not included. It's not funded. And so it'll have to be the subject of discussion as you go forward and decide how that rates as a priority and how you want to put that into the budget and what you want to take out in order to create the ability to go to that rate reduction. It's an important need. There's no question about it. We've wrestled with it too and tried to figure out a way to do it in this proposed budget, and we just can't have it in there.
So what you're saying to me is it might not change.
Well, everything might not change, and everything may change. I mean, it's all subject to your debate as to what happens. And so this is simply this is a starting point, as we all know. This is the very first step in your process of the budget. It's not our first step, obviously. We've been at it for a few months, but this is the very first step in the process. And the fact that something is in or out does not guarantee that at the end of the day it will be in or it will be out.
Well, my only issue here was since I've toured several of those, I know that the rates that they charge and the work they do is much cheaper than what the state does. And I can't believe that we would run the risk of having some of these people go out of business, which is what's going to happen if we don't do something. Again, as a state representative, and especially in my area, it's not probable that I can just stand by and let that go. And I've had conversations with Mr. Block and the governor and a lot of folks about when and why, and I was under the impression when we left here last year this was going to be taken care of. Now it's on the unfunded budget part, and I thought this was all taken. I'm not understanding.
Well, Unfortunately, when you go back to that list that LDH will share with you of how they have to make reductions, these are optional services and they're not mandated Medicaid services, and so they have to spend the dollars on what's mandated. And unfortunately, these are these are great services. They're important services. I don't disagree with anything you're saying, and we want to work with you to try and see what we can do. But in terms of putting together the initial budget and looking at funding at LDH's level, this is in that category that is unfortunately eligible to be reduced, whereas other things are not.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Billiard?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, when we was talking about the $4 billion and get it all down to what, isn't also in that $4 billion that some money could be used as some matching money for federal funds or anything that would become available that would increase our income?
Yes, sir. Some of that money that is not presently available is used for matching money and would draw down federal dollars. That's why those federal dollars are also listed as money that's not available today, because we haven't recognized that state revenue.
And I know at the last meeting that we had, there was a conversation that was going on where that it showed that at the end of the year, we collected $300 million more than what we had projected it and these things, but wasn't it also money that came in from the flood and things pertaining to that showed an income that came in?
The main increase was in corporate and personal income. That's where the spike occurred, and to the extent that some of it was related to people buying things in the wake of the flood and building homes again and making investments, that may be part of what that personal income was.
In May.
And it's collected in May. That's the other point. I mean, it comes in usually in May, and so that's when you get the spike in the estimate, because that's when the big collection month.
And waiting much longer, are we going to have can you foresee some problems that may come up
Well,
if we don't have the matches or whatever?
Well, sure, if we don't ultimately recognize the revenue, but I mean, the conversation today suggests at some point we're going to recognize the revenue, and so the problem of not having revenue recognized will be alleviated. And then we'll go back to the more traditional discussion of what are the priorities and where we can allocate the resources we have. We're simply saying, let's talk about the reality of the resources we think we're going to have, and if it's not quite as much as we think it is, we'll have to talk about what gets funded and what doesn't.
Talking to higher ed, I mean, they're pretty excited about being stable now and moving ahead and being able to hire professors and do the things that they need to go do to make sure that our economics continues to grow in the state.
Well, I'm hopefully this does send a message of our proposal to want to plus up higher ed in a meaningful way, and hopefully that you'll be able to find a way to do that in the budget that is finally enacted.
I know people are pretty excited. You know, back the Avondale shipyard is open again, but it's not building ships, it's doing containers and those things, but it's because of like this, showing a great forecast and things that are happening in the state that people want to come in and invest money into our communities.
Well, that's certainly what we're seeing. That's certainly what we expect to see continuing. I mean, this is a time where we ought to be pleased with the improvements that we've made in our overall budgeting, pleased with the fact that we're having surpluses, pleased with the fact that our economists are telling us that things are better and there is more revenue available for us to spend. That's a very positive thing for the state, that is a reflection of the positive economic energy that's underway.
And I know by talking with some of the teachers and all, they're pretty excited about being recognized now for the jobs that they're doing and how important that education part is to our community and economic growth. Thank you very much.
Representative Omni?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me see. On your proposed budget, page number 6, you had mentioned some changes in TOs, and I just wanted to review a few here. In the TO column, I see the highest increase, according to this chart, says Department of Education with 99. And on your unfunded budget issues page of your presentation, it mentions Department of Education reductions, 2.3 million and 41 positions. So can you explain the difference there?
Yeah, the 41 positions that are referred to as being reduced don't have anything to do with the other list of TOs. Those are the conversions I was talking about, where people were non-TO'd in civil services. You've got to make these people part of the table of organization because they're permanent employees, and so they've been converted from non-TO to TO. That represents the increase in the Department of Education budget.
So that's the 99.
That's the 99.
So we're not actually looking at any new persons walking in, they've just reclassified.
That's correct. That's
Okay.
correct. That's much better said than I said it.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be useful. So the 41 positions, that are called a reduction here, are those real people leaving positions?
Yes, ma'am. Potentially, yeah.
So they're not moving and being reclassified?
Oh, some are vacant.
morning.
Teresa Hutchinson. In the recommendation, we didn't reduce the 41 positions because that is an estimate of what they may have to do. But then as the budget goes on, the department can decide how they'll take that reduction.
Okay, so where it says 41 right here, it's simply saying, should we not have an increase in funding, this
They had to
may
take
happen.
that cut, yes. It may
I
be
see.
41, but in the 99, that is a reflection of the non-TO conversion into TO.
Okay, so in the proposed budget, we're not actually gaining or losing anybody in that on that line. It's just a reclassification. And in the unfunded budget issues page of your presentation, that is, if we don't find, it looks like $81 million more dollars.
No, it's not that much. But
Oh, when I added up this whole list, it comes to 81 million.
Oh, the whole list, but just as to those 41 positions would be if the department chose to not have those people available in order to meet that monetary amount that is unfunded, then that's when they would not be there. But if they choose to find the cut somewhere else, they may decide some of these positions we actually need, some we're going to just let go,
Okay.
if no changes take place in the budget.
Should I assume that the 2.3 million that's mentioned here is what the 41 positions cost?
Yes,
Okay, so that's not 2.3 million and 41 positions.
That's right.
That's the same item. Okay. Let's see. On the line, on page 6 again, the line for health and hospitals, I see TO an increase of 34. Is that also a number that's simply being reclassified?
Primarily, there was an increase, I know, of 6 positions for the WIC program, and I'll have to look up to see the specifics, but some of it was conversions of the non-TO or other charges positions.
Okay, so some are reclassification and some might be new positions, new hires. Okay. And Children and Family Services, I'm concerned, there is a reduction of 15. Is that 15 less staff, or is that a reclassification?
It's vacant positions that have been vacant for more than 12 months, and that is the standard procedure we do with all of the agencies. If a position has been vacant, then we will reduce it. But there are still probably over 200 vacancies at the department right now.
Okay, so this 15 does not represent a person who's receiving a paycheck this week who won't be around next week?
Correct.
Okay, good. That's helpful. Now, just one general question on that same page. I see down near the bottom of the list, I have higher education, other education, Department of Education. What's other education?
The special schools and commissions, NOCA,
School for the-
School for the Deaf, School for the
Okay,
Blind.
so they're separated right here on this chart. Okay, so I don't see any specific information because I don't think that you intended to get down into the weeds this much, but please tell me how the proposal for education affects non-public schools.
Yeah, one of the slides shows you $3.7 million for required services. That's a plus up. That was zero last time, this current budget year, and that's a 3.7.
They had some.
Oh,
It
they
was
had
a
s-
restoration.
Okay, I'm sorry. They had some. It was a restoration for what was taken last year. So they're getting 3.7 million more for required services. Those are the services that are provided by the private parochial schools that we, the state, makes them do, and we provide some funding for them to do it. So they had asked for an entire restoration. This is approximately half of what they had asked
So
us
it's
to
a
do.
partial restoration.
Yes.
Do you remember what slide that was on?
No, but we could tell you.
Okay.
It's on the education slide. It's going to be on.
Slide 43.
Okay, on page 22, slide 43? Okay. All right, thank you for helping me
Let me
find
just
that.
mention in response, and Teresa mentioned this, but just to make this clear, if a position is vacant for more than a year in our budget process that we go through, we take that position. We tell the agency, if you hadn't filled us for a year, then you don't need to have it. And then they have to come back in and show us that, yes, I need it. It's the reason it's vacant is such and such. We're waiting on some particular situation to develop. There are some limited situations like that where we've put them back in. But otherwise, if the position's vacant over a year, we said that's the litmus test for not being a part of it anymore.
Okay, and so you're still leaving a little margin in certain agencies for just the normal routine coming and
Oh,
going?
yeah, there are a lot of vacancies in the budget, no question about that, because there's a constant swirl of activity with people coming and going, retiring, getting hired, whatever the case may be. But just in terms of any position that was vacant for more than a year is not part of that vacancy list anymore.
Right, that makes sense, because if they've been able to perform their duties and provide the service that they're expected to serve for more than a year without that position being filled, then it seems that we could utilize that funding elsewhere more efficiently, more effective. Thank you. I think we had that discussion a couple of times over these last couple of years. All right. Those are all the questions I have for now. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Representative Jay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, there seemed to be a suggestion that in the coming weeks and months that there will be a recognition of revenue in addition to what has been currently recognized, and that will somehow repair our ability to piece together a budget, whether that's self-generated fees, et cetera. I wanted you to be able to address some of the concerns that I think many of us have, which is that there was a negative impact that directly occurred as a result of a failure to recognize revenue and relates to the below-the-line appropriations from the budget law that was passed during the last legislative session. Could you address what those things were and now what we must do in order to have those funds appropriated?
Yes. And let me just say initially, and back to one of the points the speaker made, had we recognized that revenue in November at a potential higher level than we have now, we would have funded these supplemental items below the line, and we also would have contemplated coming back again and having another REC meeting if things had changed, so that that's the way it works. Every quarterly, you're anticipating making a change up or down depending upon what revenue looks like. So,
in fact, we considered all of those things when this legislature passed a budget at the end of our final special session last year, and believed that there would be available revenue to fund these very items.
right. I'm looking at the list, and
It's things like housing of local offenders and sheriffs and juvenile justice.
It would
Yeah.
have been like Department of Corrections to fund the vacant positions that were not funded, attrition, the open up of Acadiana, there were some of the funds for OJJ for Raise the Age, funding in for the executive department for the Elwyn system.
And so as a result, I guess the point is we now will have to do that again in a supplemental bill during the next legislative session?
yes, as I said, we won't recommend every single item because it's too late for some, but we'll have a number of these items that were not funded in the current year budget, recommended to be funded in the supplemental bill. And it delayed us on Bunkie. We were going to be staffing up a little earlier and moving forward on Bunkie quicker. We're now on schedule to open in March and complete the entire transition by the fall to a full opening. But again, that's of course dependent upon the money being there in the budget, as we hope and expect it will be.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Long?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, for those of us who have been here a few years, we've gone through this process, and one of the things that I think is something that we deal with is the word projections. Can you, and I see Greg Albright in the audience, but there seems to be a sense of optimism that the growth that we're talking about is sustainable. What gives you the confidence, which I also have, as we move forward, that we're not going to be saddled with some disappointments as the economy, which we cannot control? But I guess my question is, what gives you confidence as we move forward that these dollars are going to continue to be a part of state government?
Well, we're 8 months into the year. We're out of 12 months, we have data now. We have real data. And one of the points that we've been making in this RAC discussion is that our projections, our forecast must be based upon data, upon facts, upon a realistic projection by the people we pay, the economists, to tell us what they think the economy looks like. And both of them have told us they think the economy looks better and has improved, and they both have recommended additional money for the current year, just like they did back before the end of the year. They will be able to speak better than I can about what they see going forward, but I think I can say, because I've heard them both say, they don't anticipate things going in the tank between now and the end of the year, in which such time we have to pass the 20 budget. So I think just the general knowledge of the economy, the overall employment in this state, all trending in the same direction, the growth that we're seeing, the economists telling us that things are better, all point toward a more optimistic forecast and a more realistic assessment that we can budget based upon those numbers. And that's what we have to go on. That's what we ought to be going on. And that's the argument that we've been making, that it's time to face the reality that things are doing better, and our economists are telling us that, and our budget projections ought to project that.
Well, let me say this: I'm as optimistic as I have been in many years. I was in a meeting last night. There were 3 or 4 representatives that were there, with about 65 residents, teachers, educators from the Rapides Parish. Very positive meeting. I think for the first time, our people throughout Louisiana see sunshine instead of rain. And I think it's encouraging that as we move through this process, and by the way, there's nothing dirty about the word surplus. It ought to be what we're doing to create opportunities for teachers to have a modest pay raise. I sit on the Legislative Council of the Southern Regional Educational Board. We are behind other southern states, and we're dramatically behind the nation as a whole. So I applaud the leadership. I'm grateful for what we're doing on the House side as well as the Senate side. But I see sunshine, and I'm very encouraged. And thank you for your leadership.
The governor is very pleased to be able to recommend this pay raise for teachers, something that's been talked about, and there hasn't been a whole lot of dissent to wanting to give pay raises to teachers. The discussion will be obviously the amount and how it's confected, and that's appropriate, but there seems to be a general sense that it's time for a raise, and we believe absolutely the money is there to do it, and it ought to be a priority.
Representative Jackson?
I think the staff has me straight on this, and I think I understand why you didn't propose an actual budget today, right? Executive budget. My concern is this: when I keep hearing that your budget, maybe rightfully so, I believe rightfully so, is based on the $130 million, I think that was to re-recognize at the Revenue Estimating Conference. When I first sat down and I started listening to you talk, I thought that this unfunded budget issue would be covered if we went to the $130 million.
No, it's
But
not.
I've been told by staff that if we recognize the lower number, right, which is 90.1 million, that's going to add, what, about 40.1 million to this unfunded budget list?
That's right.
Because I need that clarification.
That's correct.
So we're kind of being asked questions, our members are asking questions about this unfunded budget list. But if Revenue Estimating Conference meets again and only recognizes the 90.1 million, then there's going to be about 40.1 million added to this list.
That's correct.
Where do you anticipate that coming from?
Well, I'm not prepared to answer that right now. We'll deal with that if we have to deal with that.
But I mean, you went through the litany with the chairperson that we have statutory debts, we have certain things that must be paid. We only have about 30 billion, I think it is, that we actually have discretionary.
We kind of rounded it up to 4
billion, right?
something,
3 point something billion. And we already talked about and acknowledged today that that's a low number, right? But we're going to add to that discretionary, we're going to take away from it another 40.1 million if Revenue Estimating Conference meets again and recognizes the low number, right?
Right.
And so where else can we take? I know you may not be prepared to give us the exact place that you would propose or where the unfunded budget will rise to or where it would come from, But where else do we have discretion that we can take that $40.1 million odd dollars from?
Right. Well, first, let me say, based on the very first thing you said, I want to make it absolutely clear, and I think y'all understand this. You do have a projected budget in front of you. You have all the budget with everything in it. It is just not termed the executive budget. It's a proposed budget for spending based upon that $134 million being recognized by REC. Now, the answer to your question is the area that could be looked at is the same area you always look at, the general fund, which is primarily education and health care. So the debate would then focus on what are the priorities as between a teacher pay raise, an increase in the MFP, the funding for optional Medicaid services as the big ticket items, the big dollar items that drive those general fund. Because you remember that pie chart that shows higher education, Department of Health, and Department of Education are the biggest chunks of the pie when it comes to distributing the general fund. And so that's where you will be looking. You will be having to balance what is the priority at that point between these proposals we've made in this budget and other things that need to be funded. You'd be considering what's unfunded on that sheet before you today, and you'd add to it another $40 million of things that are funded that you'd have to decide we don't have enough money to fund it if that's what REC's decision is.
And that's going to pretty much come from healthcare, higher education.
And general fund, and in departments that rely upon general fund for their funding, which is a lot of the areas of government that we've always talked about, and that we've talked about, for example, with across-the-board cuts in times of budget distress. Or we've targeted programs that would have to be discontinued because the money is simply not there.
Okay, and that's my concern with that. With this $18 million of unfunded budget issues that you foresee, even if Revenue Estimating Conference recognizes the $130 million, is there a plan or proposal to deal with that? Or, of course, I think that falls legislatively on us to deal with, right?
Well, it does. Obviously, the governor's not proposing any new revenue for the state.
Right.
We're not proposing to go there. And so, absent any new revenue coming in, you only have a finite amount of the pie to distribute. And if the pie is not going to be baked bigger, you have to decide who's going to get those slices.
And for the fiscal year 19, we're still waiting on some things to be recognized there too as well.
Yes.
So what would we do? Would that move over into the fiscal year 20 or?
No. Once REC meets and recognizes an improved forecast for 19, which we think will happen, then that would create the potential for money to be expended in the supplemental bill that'll be filed during the session.
And is there a discrepancy over what we should recognize for that year?
There's going to be a difference in the forecast. It's interesting because Manfred and Greg will tell you their forecasts are generally fairly similar. What's interesting is they also forecast out years, and Greg is more conservative in his estimate for FY20, but much more aggressive on his estimate for the out years. I mean, dramatically so, more so than Manfred is. But Greg has basically an automatic multiplier that he builds in for growth, as he's testified to. So I think as to the 19 budget, I don't remember the numbers, but there is going to be a difference between Manfred's recommendation and Greg's recommendation for 19. But both of them suggest there is more money available in the current year for you to be able to appropriate in a supplemental bill.
Okay, and so we appropriated contingency, how much of that?
You appropriate
in 19. No, in 19, we already appropriated a contingency amount.
No, but that's gone.
Gone.
The below the line expired at the end of the calendar year because the language of the appropriations bill.
No, I understand that, but I'm saying we're going to have to replace it. It was part of our proposed budget. So how much is that? That when we do the supplemental bill, whatever's extra in 19 is going to have to go to that. And how much is it?
It's $44 million, but we will not be recommending that all $44 million be expended because the need for some of that money has gone because it's too late in the fiscal year to make it to make the appropriation. I don't have a breakdown of what that is, but it's going to be a portion of the 44 we will recommend not be funded in the supplemental bill.
And how would that be absorbed?
Well, it won't be absorbed necessarily. Like for Acadiana, we couldn't open up Acadiana earlier this year, so they didn't need the money. So then I wouldn't recommend to give Office of Juvenile Justice the money to open up Acadiana. That's what he's referring to, that it's not going to be all 44
Okay,
million.
I understand now. So it's not things that you actually cut. It's things that we anticipated opening. Job creation was there. I know that was a major issue, but we just will forego it.
That's right.
So once you recommend that, because I'm getting caught up real fast, we may have some extras to supplement.
Yes.
which goes to this question, does that have to be spent on fiscal year 19, or can it be moved over to handle some of this unfunded budget issues for 2020?
If it's recognized, then you have the opportunity to spend it in a supplemental bill, and if it is not all spent, it becomes surplus for the current year, which would mean next year it would be spent as surplus money under the limitations in law as to how that money must be spent.
Right, and
so you will, I'm sure you will debate this. You'll discuss whether we want to supplement the budget for an agency this year because of an acute need that is presented, or do we want to wait and hold that money as surplus, and then it'll go 10% to unfunded accrued liability, X% to rainy day fund, and X% to one-time purposes. I mean, it becomes, the excess in the current year becomes surplus
Right.
at the end of the year.
So basically, it wouldn't go to handle any of this unfunded budget issues because this is not one-time usage.
That's right.
So we either spend it or send it back to what surplus is used for.
That's right.
Okay, so those are my questions, Mr. Chairman. Just want
Gotcha.
to make sure we didn't have something we can cover this with before we hit another dent in it.
Gotcha. Representative Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Commissioner, it seems like when we got elected in 2016, I think we were faced with, what, a $1.6 billion deficit or something like that. We were faced with cuts to the Department of Health, education, senior centers. That became very urgent that we solve that problem. And then you were asked earlier about fiscal year 17. I believe we had an RAC miss of approximately $125 million or so, and we had to use the rainy day funds. You remember all of that?
I do.
And we accepted that. We accepted that that $125 million deficit, and we had to tap into the rainy day fund, right?
Yes, sir.
And make hard decisions and avoid drastic cuts and even make some cuts, and certainly no growth of this state's budget during those times. And just like we accepted the bad, perhaps now is the time we accept the good. And so I'm looking at this budget and I see an investment in education. I see teacher pay raises. I see investment in DCFS, Department of Children and Family Service, of $8.8 million. So thank you for your good work. Thank the governor for his good work. Thanks for all of our good work on this. And I think it's time that we accept the good, just like we have to swallow the bad. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Representative Bacala.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jay, I'm looking at page 6 and 7 of your proposed budget, and I do feel your pain in trying to create a document that perhaps is lacking. On page 7, it notes that your proposed budget increases spending by the state by $802 million. Am I reading that right? That's on page 7.
Yep. Yes, sir. Total needs of financing, that is correct.
Well, we propose to spend an additional $802 million in the proposed budget, right?
Largely federal dollars, that's correct.
And of the $802 million in additional spending, $978 million is in health. So health goes up by $978, and collectively everybody else goes down by $150 million. I'm simply doing a subtraction, 802 versus, or 978 minus 802.
I'm sure your math is probably right, but
It's mostly fees and stuff generated for that MSIP program.
yeah. And just as I mentioned,
Collectively, everybody goes down by 176 million, and Department of Health goes up by 978 million, and that is simple math.
in terms of total financing, that's correct, but it's important to also recognize that the increase that you see in the Department of Health, primarily driven by this MSIP program we've talked about, is from self-generated revenue, not from general fund dollars. And so you're correct in the aggregate, all means of financing, it does go up by that level, and there is that much for the Department of Health.
And I do appreciate the fact this is a difficult document to create. That's concerning to me, though. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Waite.
Commissioner, I got staff going to get some numbers for me, but on the page 8, on the prison population, where we haven't, where we're showing that we, since 16, we've had approximately 3,000 state prisoners released.
Yes.
My question is, of those, you ready? You
Yes.
can find you.
I got it.
Okay. Of those, I want to know how many of them were released from state facilities and how many from local facilities. As you know, and we've talked several times, and we didn't quite get to pay the sheriffs their money this year, but that we still owe them about $40 million. But the blended rate for the state's approximately $54 a day, which is, I don't know, $150 million a year for 3,000 releases we should save. And the parish rate is $24.39, which is half that or less than half that. But what I'm hearing is we're letting more parish prisoners out than state ones. Do you know that, or why we're doing
they're
that?
all state. They're all state.
But I'm thinking
inmates.
facilities. I'll
Right,
say
right,
facilities.
yeah. That's what- just
Why are
wanted
we
to
letting
clarify.
the cheaper ones out?
They're the ones who are the least risk.
Well,
And so
not always. I mean,
well, the answer to your question is all the inmates are state inmates.
I know they're all
but I
state
just want
inmates.
to clarify, and the ones who go to the parish prisons, by and large, are the ones who are deemed lower risks. And when we act pursuant to the legislation on justice reinvestment and released early, most of those early releases were those who were deemed less risk, and therefore they were at parish prisons. Now, the other point you made, though, the rate for reimbursing those sheriffs remains statutorily fixed at a higher rate than what is actually budgeted for, and so that's why you always see a supplemental appropriation for the sheriffs to catch them up.
I understand. So, how do you? I still, you know, the ones released, we've had some violent crimes, several murders from people that's been released in the last year. So I may differ with you. They may be convicted of a lesser crime, but they may be no less of a criminal than some of the folks that's in our state facilities.
I don't dispute that. I mean, I think you're always going to make judgments based upon an assessment of risk of someone's in potential to be a recidivist or to create a more violent crime, but you're never going to get it all completely right, I'd say. But I think by and large, the lesson that's been learned is that the early releases have been appropriate in reducing the size of the inmate population and hopefully getting people on a footing that's going to make them productive citizens instead of worse criminals.
Well, I would like to know the ones that come out of the state prisoners that are released from local facilities at half the cost, and the ones released from our state facilities at twice the cost.
I understand. I don't have that information, but I'll
Yeah,
certainly
can you all get that to the committee
Sure.
in time?
No,
Gotcha.
absolutely. And I'm sure the department will be prepared to discuss that with you in detail.
Gotcha.
Okay, and I know the cost and the risk, and I'm not necessarily saying Angola were the vast majority of lifers. I understand that. Okay, but some of our other facilities are holding prisoners that are not high risk either. As you would say, there's the ones that are in local facilities. So, all right, I was just interested to see that. I've never seen a breakdown.
We'll get that for you.
All right, thank you.
Representative Harris? Well, we're trying. Hold on. There we go.
All right. Just a real quick question. You said Acadiana has not been opened yet?
Correct.
There's cars there when I go by.
Those are employees. They're staffed up and they're
Okay,
getting
so
ready to be
it's you already are paying dollars out there.
Yes.
Was that appropriated above or under the line?
No, the only thing they could expend was what was above the line.
Okay.
So the people who are being paid out of the budget that's already been approved for the Acadiana facility. The opening date is targeted for March and the full ramp up for June. But that they've not been able to spend what was otherwise below the line that would have had them opened earlier. They'd be open now if they had gotten that below the line appropriation. That's what was contemplated.
So how long have they been working there at this facility?
I'll have to find out. I can't tell you exactly since when, but I mean, at some point they're expending the budget that's been allocated to them for that purpose.
So they playing checkers or what?
No, sir. They're starting to try to ramp up. You have to make purchases in order to get the facility ready. Some of the people that are there, getting it ready to train. I think there was about $4 million that was budgeted for that, so that's where that money is from.
So if something would have happened, whether it's REC or not, let's say something disastrous would have happened, and REC couldn't didn't recognize any more money, actually had to make cuts, then we would have these employees out there even without the 44 million if it didn't materialize. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do know what you're saying. If there wasn't a recognition of the additional money, those people probably would have been released. I mean, that would not have been something the department, I'm sure, I'm not speaking for Secretary Bush, but I think his answer would have been, well, if I don't have the money to open the facility, I don't need you guys anymore. But they're not there just piddling around. They're being trained. A lot of these are new hires who have to be trained to work in a facility like this, and they're preparing the facility for opening.
Well, I appreciate it. I just want to clear up that it is open, I mean, for employees,
Correct.
but no incarcerated individuals
That's
yet.
right. That's right.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Representative Walsworth, excuse me, Senator Walsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jay, I guess next week we start implementing raise the age on the first section, which is the misdemeanor side. In the rural areas, that has a quick impact on them. There's a lot of difference between that person going into the adult side, which is $25 a day, and going back into the juvenile side, which is $250 a day. The whole amount is put on the backs of the locals until it's convicted, and that's when they become ours. We sent that down but it is truly an unfunded mandate back to the locals, and what we hear from the department, hey, here's some things, but at the end of the day, the locals are starting basically in 1 week is going to have a new set of problems out there. And it's not, let's just send them home to mama and hopefully we won't see them. I truly hope that y'all will try to find some savings dollars to go into the rural communities to see if we can help find some answers out there instead of just saying, hey, we're just going to make sure it goes to juvenile justice. Rural areas are already trying to keep them going back to mothers, dads, whatever they can. But there is a real concern that a week from, I guess, today starts the 17-year-old going back into the juvenile side. So I'm just asking that.
We absolutely will look at that, and I don't have any particular information on that, but I understand what your concern is, and I'm sure you'll be raising it during the discussions with the department when they come in and talk about
Absolutely.
their budget.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Gotcha. Thank you. Your individual income tax are going up right now on collections, and that's based on the federal changes, and then the corporate returns are coming a little bit higher, and that's because we're kicked in the 2015 policy changes that we made. We see an adjustment for those two.
Yes, I think that's right. Secretary Robinson, I believe, is here, and
I think
it's fair to say
nothing against Secretary Robinson, but I got a low quorum to start off with.
I think it's fair to say it is in part result of the federal changes that ironically wound up Louisianians having to pay more in their state income tax, as well as an improvement in the economy and more people work. And I think it's a combination.
and then obviously we raise sales tax. Okay, the board is clear. Thank you for your time.